Today's lesson is Module 2, Lesson 9, Sums and Differences of Decimals. And for those of you who don't remember, sums mean to add and differences mean to subtract. And before we even get started on today's lesson, we are first going to talk about place value with decimals. So we know that the whole numbers that come before our decimal, we know those place values. The first place next to the decimal is 1. And then we have our tens, then hundreds, then thousands, then 10,000s, then 100,000s, and then million. And then after the decimal, that first place after the decimal is tenths, with that THS on the end. Then we have hundredths, then thousandths, then 10,000ths, then 100,000ths. So that will help us with knowing where things go in today's lesson. Whenever we see a decimal, we read that as the word and. Let me pull that down so you can see it. So now we're going to get on with today's actual lesson. So I'm going to draw a little line to separate my place value. And the first thing that we're going to talk about is converting fractions to decimals. We did this back in Module 1. The one thing I want you to remember is when converting a fraction to a decimal, the very first thing you can always do is to divide the numerator by the denominator. That will always work. So for example, if I have the fraction 1/2 and I want to turn that into a decimal, I can just divide 1 by 2. How many 2's are in 1? There are 0, and 0 times 2 is 0. I subtract, bring down my 1. I have to add in a decimal, and I go ahead and put that right up into my quotient, into my answer, and then I add in a 0. Now, how many 2's are in 10? There are 5. So 5 times 2 is 10. I can stop right there. So the equivalent of 1/2 as a decimal is 0.5. You can have the 0 in front of the decimal if you'd like, but it's not actually necessary. The next thing you can do to convert a fraction to a decimal is simply write it how you read it. Write it how you read it. So, for example, if the fraction they give you is 3/10, then I simply write that the way that I read it, and I can go back to my chart here, and I know that tenths is the first place after the decimal. So when I write it, I can say that 3/10 is equivalent to, I put in my decimal, and then my 3 goes right into that tenths place. So when I read this, I'm actually saying 3/10. That's how I read that fraction. Another thing that you can do is change or convert the denominator to 10 or 100 if possible. Then write it how you read it. So I'm going to give you another example of that. So if I have 2/5, I know that I can change 5 to 10 by multiplying it by 2. Whatever I do to the bottom, I do to the top. So now my fraction is 4/10, and I read that as 4/10. And if I go back and I look again at my chart, I know that tenths is right after the decimal. So I would write 4/10 as 0.4. That is the same thing. These two are the same thing. If I have, for example, 27/50ths, I know that I can change 50 to 100, so I times this by 2 and I times this by 2. So 50 times 2 is 100, and 2 27s is 54. So I read this as 54 hundredths. That's how I read that. So when I go back and I look at my chart, I see that hundredths is the second place. So I know that my number should take up 2 places after the decimal point. So the 54 hundredths now converts itself to 0.54. When we convert mixed numbers to decimals, we're going to do two things. We're going to keep the whole number, and then our second step is to write the fraction as a decimal. So for example, if I have 3 4/10, I keep my whole number 3. When I read this 3 4/10, I know that my decimal is going to be right after my whole number. That's where my decimal will always go. I remember from checking on previous examples that the tens place falls right after the decimal, so that converts to 3.4. Now we're going to get into the actual adding and subtracting of decimals. So adding or subtracting fractions, and I'm going to put decimals right here in parentheses because today's lesson is really about changing fractions into decimals and then adding, and then we can also change those answers back to fractions. So our first step is to convert mixed numbers or fractions into decimals. Our step 2 is to line up the digits using place value. So you can refer back to that place value chart if you need to. And then finally add or subtract whatever operation they give you in the problem. So for example, if I have 3 7/10 plus 2 4/100, actually let's make this 42/100 just to make it a little bit easier for the example. The first thing I'm going to do is convert my mixed number to a fraction or to a decimal. So my first one, I read it as 3 7/10. My next one I read as 2. Notice I'm putting my 2 right under my 3 because they're both in the ones place. And I'm lining up my decimal. That's very important that you line up your decimal. 42/100. Now, when adding or subtracting decimals, sometimes you will have a number that doesn't have anything above it or below it. That's okay. Because remember, there can always be a 0 after numbers. So what this is saying is 3.70 plus 2.42. So now I'm just going to simply add 0 plus 2 is 0. Is 2. 7 plus 4 is 11. I put down my 1. I regroup. 1 plus 3 is 4, plus 2 more is 6. So this becomes my answer. 6 12/100. I know that this is hundredths because my 2 is in my hundredths place. So I can actually go back and write my answer as a fraction. I'm going to keep my whole number, 6, and then what I'm going to do is take the 2 numbers that come after my decimal. That's going to be my numerator. My denominator will be 100 because this goes over to the hundredths place. So now we're going to take out our book and we are going to do some practice together. If you take out your book and you open it up to Lesson 9, Sums and Differences. It's on page S39 in Module 2. The very first problem that they give us is 25 3/10 plus 77 1/100. So the first thing I'm going to do is rewrite this. I'm going to keep my whole number, 25, and then I know right after that is going to come my decimal, and then I'm going to write 3/10 just the way that I read it, which means that 3 goes in the 10th place, which is the first place after the decimal. Then next I have 376. So my 6 is in the ones place, so it's going to go right under my 5, which is in the ones place. My 7 is in the tens place, so it's going to go right below my 2, which is in the tens place. And then I have my 3. I'm going to go ahead and put in my decimal because I know that my decimal comes right after my whole number. And then I'm going to write my fraction just the way that I read it, 77 hundredths. My operation is to add. Again, I can go ahead and put in my 0 if I want as a placeholder, just so I have something visual to look at. I know that 0 plus 7 is 7. 3 plus 7 is 10. I write down my 0. I regroup. 1 plus 5 is 5. Plus 6 more is 12. I'm sorry, 1 plus 5 is 6. Plus 6 more is 12. Put down my 2. Regroup my 1. 1 plus 2 is 3. Plus 7 more is 10. Write down my 0. Regroup my 1. 1 plus 3 is 4. So my answer is 402 7/100. So if I wanted to write that as a fraction, I'm going to keep my whole number the same, and then I'm going to put my decimal as a fraction. Because the 7 is in the hundredths place, I'm just going to write 7. If you put 0, 7, that's fine. But I know that I have to have 100 on bottom because the 7 is in the hundredths place. So now let's go on to example number 2. In example number 2, we're actually going to be subtracting this time. So the first thing I need to do is convert. So I have 426 as my whole number, and then I know my decimal follows my whole number. Now I have this fraction 1/5. And if you remember in our notes, we talked about when we have a number that's not 10 or 100, we can try to change that number to 10 or 100. So I know that I can easily change 5 to 10 by multiplying it by 2. Whatever I do to the bottom, I have to do to the top. So 1 times 2 is 2, and 5 times 2 is 10. I write 2/10 as 0.2. My next number is 275. So I put that right under using place value. My decimal point, I'm going to line that up because I know how important that is. And then my fraction is 1/2. And again, I know that I can easily change that 2 to a 10 by multiplying by 5. So whatever I do to the bottom number, I do to the top number. So 1 times 5 is 5, and 2 times 5 is 10. So it is 5/10. And then I subtract. Since I can't take 5/10 from 2/10, I have to regroup. This becomes a 5, and now this becomes 12. Because I'm giving 10 more tenths to the 2. So I have 12 minus 5 gives me 7. I go ahead and bring down my decimal point because I want to make sure it stays lined up. And then 5 minus 5 is 0. And I can't take 70 from 20, so I have to regroup. This becomes a 3. This becomes a 12. 12 minus 7 is 5. And then 3 minus 2 is 1. So now I can write this if I would like as a fraction. If I want to put it back in fraction form, I keep my whole number. And then because I know that I only have one number behind my decimal, that my fraction will be 10. And then whatever number I have behind the decimal becomes my numerator. So that answer becomes 150 and 7/10, just the same as it was with the decimal. You're going to now go on to the class exercises, and you're going to answer questions 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. You're going to need to read your problems carefully, set up your addition or subtraction problem first using fractions, then convert those into decimals, and finally solving those. On number 5, notice that it says to use a calculator to convert the fractions first, because these fractions don't easily change to 100, so make sure that you're actually changing those fractions using your calculator. And then today's assignment is to do problems under number 1. I want you to do A, and I want you to do D, and then I want you to do both A and B under problem number 2. So you will have 4 problems in the problem set as well as your exit ticket. If you have any questions, feel free to ask.